Hello, how do you do? It's good to see you again. I'm sorry it's been so long, but you know how it is. But it is a pleasure to have you back. What I'd like to do is in our meetings as I get back into a schedule, I've gotten back into a schedule on just about everything else except for our meetings. So you're unfortunately the last thing to be put back in its place. But what I'd like to do is continue meeting once a week. I think that's a nice frequency. And I'd like to still share a poem with you, either of my own composition or one that I thought was inspiring or one that struck me over the last week, or really just, I suppose, enjoyed. But I'd also like to share a book recommendation or interact with some literary work with you as well, so that way we get a touch of poetry as well as a touch of or a recommendation of something else that you might read that might benefit you or you might just enjoy, honestly. What I'd like to do today, since it's at the beginning of the year, and we did this last year actually, and I thought it was kind of fun to sit down and kind of look through everything that I had read, I'd like to share with you all of the books that I've read this last year. What I'm not including in that is any like standalone poetry, because as you know, often what happens is if I'm walking around or just stopping and trying to sit for 5-10 minutes, I'll sit down with a book of poetry and read a couple poems, or I'll sit down and read an article in a subscription that I've recommended that you've seen those before, or just read something shorter form. I found myself actually reading a couple things on my phone, which I typically don't read electronically in a digital medium that way. And then also because my kids enjoy it, I either read stories to them or we got audiobooks that we would listen to. So I'm not including any of those things. So this is kind of a very bare bones, just the physical books that I read. So there's all the caveats there, but I'd like to take you through these. And then I would still like to share a poem with you, have something poetic to kind of end our meeting today. But why don't we just jump in? Okay, and this is in no particular order actually. I read a couple. Now, of course, this isn't quite fair because I read this devotionally every day as well, but I read a couple different books of the Bible. It's really easy to think of the Bible as this monolithic book in and of itself, which in some way it is, but it's also quite literally a library unto itself. It's its own collection of several different literary works, different literary genres at different points in history. And a couple times throughout this last year, I was either struck or curious about something where I wanted to kind of do, not a huge deep dive, but really interact with a book of Scripture itself. So this last year, I found myself, I read through the letter to the Hebrews last year, and I've done that actually for the last couple of years. I kind of returned to it. It's an easy read. It's not very long, but the theology packed into it is very interesting. Whoever the author is, a lot of the early Christian writers weren't confident on this score, but a lot of them surmised that the Apostle Paul was the author. I think modern scholarship tends to think that that's less likely. I don't know. I don't really know anything about that. As far as I'm concerned, the sacred author probably doesn't matter too much. If it was Paul, that's great. If not, I don't think it obviously doesn't really change anything. But it's a interaction with the New Covenant. So this is a book in the New Testament. It's an interaction from a Hebrew perspective, as the title would tell you, the letter to the Hebrews. So it's looking at the New Covenant, the age of the church and Christ and everything like that from the perspective of a first century Jew. So okay, now what do we do with the temple and temple ritual worship? What does that mean for all of those different very Jewish aspects? How do those find their fulfillment and fruition in now the theology of the church? So that was very interesting. Of course, any book of the Bible I highly recommend to you. The other book that I read, I was put onto it by a family member, actually. I was happily, I'll boast for just a second. I was happy to find that in one interaction I was asked, in the Gospels, what book of the Old Testament does Jesus quote from most? And that's such an interesting question because that would tell you a lot about the overall message Jesus is trying to communicate. And I actually had when they asked me this, I had very good confidence in what the answer was, and I instantly said, well, I think it's Deuteronomy, which is one of the books of the 5 books of Moses, one of the Pentateuch. And as the name tells you, Deuteronomy, it's the second law. And it was just very interesting, and they looked at me for a second and said, how did you know that? And I don't know that I had ever heard or interacted with that base fact itself that, okay, Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy most. But I think and this is where the boast comes in, but I think I was able to intuit that because so much of the narrative of the gospel is Christ is recapitulating the Exodus and the founding of Israel, which of course leads up to the end of the Gospels, each of the Gospels, where Christ is instituting the church. The body of Christ comes out of Christ's mission as carried on by the apostles and their successors. So I was very interested in that. They said they were getting ready with a group at their church, I believe, to kind of do an in-depth study through Deuteronomy. And I was just, I couldn't get it off my mind, so I thought, well, why don't I just read through it as well? So I was able to read through that, and obviously very much enjoyed it. So anyway, I read those 2. Next, this is actually a very fun one. I had never heard of this, but this is The Reluctant Dragon by Kenneth Grahame, who of course is the author of Wind in the Willows. This is actually also illustrated by E.H. Shepard, who is if you think of the illustrations of The Wind in the Willows, he's the one. This came from my brother, my children's uncle, when our 3rd son was recently born. And he has a little script in here, a little dedication. He just says, for my nephew from your uncle on the 15th of November, 2025, God bless you, boy. So we instantly each night read a little bit of this story, and it's really very charming. It's a very charming story. There's essentially this dragon who finds himself coming out of a cave onto the English countryside, essentially, and all of the English people in the nearby village are freaked out because, well, it's a dragon. And luckily, St. George, the dragon slayer, comes through town, and St. George and this little boy who befriends the dragon, they tried to convince the dragon to, okay, well, knights and dragons are supposed to fight and kill each other. And so it's this very charming interaction between a dragon who doesn't want to be a traditional dragon and who certainly doesn't want to fight St. George, and St. George who really wants to fight the dragon. So it's a very charming story. I was surprised that I hadn't heard of it, but I'm very happy to have gotten it, and I think my sons enjoyed it. Even though they're quite young, I think they still enjoyed it a lot. So that was a lot of fun. Another thing I read is I actually read Plato's Timaeus, and then I have this copy of Dumbarton Oak's Medieval Library. I think I've shown you some of these books that I have of theirs before, but these are really very well done. First, they're just beautiful books. They're bound very nicely, and I'm a dust wrapper person, and I really like their dust wrappers. But what I really like is on one side you have the original language. Most of them are Latin because this is the medieval library. Most of the works are Latin. So on one side they have the Latin, and on the other they have a very good translation into English. So this is On Plato's Timaeus by Chalcidius. If you don't know who Chalcidius is, this work particularly was very influential for, the Timaeus was very influential for the medieval period, especially when because it's talking about the cosmos. And so the medievals got a lot of their cosmology from Plato in the Timaeus. Chalcidius, his commentary on Plato's Timaeus, was kind of the authority on the Timaeus. Individuals like J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, any real medievalist would have studied Chalcidius and really been informed by Chalcidius's commentary on the Timaeus in understanding the Timaeus specifically. So that was very interesting. I'll confess that so much of the Timaeus is mathematical, and Chalcidius in his commentary gets very, very detailed in his interacting with and commenting on the Timaeus. He gives graphs, there's geometry. It's like a math textbook. So I'll confess that I did not fully appreciate or honestly enjoy a lot of it. It is very interesting that just how rooted in the scientific method that the medievals were, that Plato was. Just very interesting. We think so often that the ancients were uninformed or didn't understand science in the way that we understand that, and it just was not true. Plato talks about in the Timaeus, and Chalcidius echoes this, that it could be determined philosophically as well as mathematically that the earth was a globe, that it wasn't flat or anything. No medievalist or Plato or anything like that thought that the earth was flat. And they did that because they knew math and they could track the heavens. So, it's just very fascinating how they arrived at correct conclusions in a way that we would never do so. We know the earth is a globe because we have pictures from outer space. And they only had math and geometry and all that sort of thing, and astronomy, and they still arrived at a correct conclusion. So very fascinating. I, at the very least, encourage you to read Plato's Timaeus. Plato's Timaeus, if you find a nice translation, is generally pretty easy to interact with. Some of the more mathy things are kind of like, it's going to go over your head more than likely, but I still enjoyed it quite a bit. This last year, I don't know if it was just this last year that I was introduced to this, but Amazon put out a series of Shakespearean plays in the form of a television series called The Hollow Crown. I think I've mentioned this to you before, and they're very well produced. The actors in them are like A and B list actors. So very good. Jeremy Irons, Benedict Cumberbatch, big names, faces that you would recognize. Those guys are playing characters. What's his name? Tom Hiddleston plays Henry V in Henry IV and Henry V. So they're very good. I had the itch to read Hamlet this year, and so I actually read through it twice. I read through it once and then started over and read through it again, because I haven't read Hamlet since, I think, middle school. So it had been just so long, and I wanted to kind of dip back into Shakespeare. So I read that. I bring up The Hollow Crown because I have watched their rendition of Richard II several times. And it's just so very good. I really, really enjoyed it. And I'll leave this out because in here is what I want to share with you as far as the poetry I had in mind. So anyway, keep that in mind. Another thing I read was I have never read through the Federalist Papers. And it had been so long since I read, like, even the U.S. Constitution. This year, I was really bitten by the bug to be more interested, more informed, and have better answers for why I have the political persuasion that I do, and not just, well, it just makes sense, and I just intuit it. I wanted to have something of a more solid way and philosophy to explain. Again, my political persuasion. So one of which, of course, is just being familiar and understanding the American Constitution. And to do so, you really need to read the Federalist Papers. And I had never read through all of them entirely. So I read the Constitution and I read the Federalist Papers. And what I was surprised about is how interesting they are to me now. I read the Constitution. You have to do that in school. So I did that in, I think, middle school. I was homeschooled during middle school, and then when I went to public school in high school, how many times did I just say school? In high school, I read it in our U.S. government class. So, but it had been since then, and of course, then when you're young, you tend to be much less interested in it. So I read those. I highly recommend that to, certainly if you're American, even if you're English or somehow associated with the Commonwealth, and I'll talk about this in a minute as well, but one of the interesting things that I interacted with this year was the difference between the French and the American Revolution. And the American Revolution really comes out of the English conservative common law tradition, whereas the French Revolution is a break from the previous traditional political order in France. And so it's just very interesting. If you're in the Commonwealth, I recommend being familiar with the American Constitution and the Federalist Papers, because so much of the American system of government is informed by English government, the unwritten constitution of the English and the common law tradition. So that was very interesting. Another thing I read is Pierce Plowman and Scriptural tradition. So this was more of an interaction with the poem Pierce Plowman, and it talks about how the poet in Pierce Plowman uses Scripture, uses theology, and what he's trying to convey, because almost the entirety of Pierce Plowman is scriptural imagery. So it was very interesting. It was a bit like, Pierce Plowman is a bit like, if you've read the Gawain poet, his work Pearl. It's very similar because, like in Pearl turns out to be like, well, it's the author's, it seems like it's the author's like deceased, like maybe daughter, and so she's his Pearl, and maybe her name was Pearl. But then the Pearl kind of changes into this picture of the church, and then the poetic imagery kind of changes to, well, the pearl is the pearl of great price, the gospel, salvation, and then the pearl ultimately is, salvation and Christ. Pierce Plowman is very similar because Pierce is just the anglicized form of Peter. And so it's interesting to see like the person of Peter, because a lot of this is written before the Reformation, and there are a lot of, a big issue in Pierce Plowman is the role of the seculars and the religious. So we think of what I mean by seculars are, priests in your local parish and the bishop and that sort of thing, whereas the religious are, monks and abbots and that sort of thing. And the authority that they both have in the life of the church. The author thought that in some way that was being abused on both sides, and so part of the critique is correcting, which of course why some of it centers on Peter, because he is seen in medieval Catholicism as the authority given by Christ, from which the bishops, and subsequently, of course, all the priests have authority over their parishes and their flocks and that sort of thing. So it's very interesting. It was interesting to read how the medieval person, even a lay person, we think of like a medieval peasant as well, they couldn't read and they didn't really understand anything. That is not true. Certainly in England, literacy was a little bit higher than most other places. But even if you can't read, you can still see and hear, and just the prayer life of a medieval person was very scripturally rich. So, it was just interesting just how, if they hear a passage of Scripture, how most, the average medieval person interpreted Scripture, saw Scripture. It was very interesting to interact with those ideas. I also read The Hobbit. The past several years, as you know, I end up reading through The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings once a year at least. So I read through The Hobbit, of course, always enjoyable. So this gets on to a little bit into my dive on the difference between the French and the American Revolution. This is my copy of Edmund Burke. So this has it's shorter, but it's his work on taste, which is, how these sensibilities of, like, again, taste, good taste. When we talk about good taste, what art do we prefer and is fitting for humans and architecture and that sort of thing. He talks about and establishes that. It was very interesting. What is also in here is his work on the sublime and the beautiful. And before reading it, I would have assumed that the sublime and the beautiful are synonymous, that those two words are synonymous. And it's very interesting that they're not. In fact, they're opposites. What is sublime is opposite from what is, or not opposite, but it is contrasted starkly with what is beautiful. The way in which I'll tease this, you really have to read it for yourself. It will change the way you see just about everything. The sublime is predicated on the human instinct of fear. And the beautiful is predicated on the human instinct of pleasure. So that which is pleasurable in some way, the soft, the delicate, the sensuous, the gentle curve, the slight slope, the varied gradation, those are beautiful. When we talk about the sublime, the big and the monstrous and darkness and sharp edges and all that sort of thing, those are what those things get at the sublime. It's very interesting. You really have to read it. It's a very interesting discourse, even on just human psychology. And the way he establishes his point is very common sense. You think it'd be too philosophical, and it's not at all. It's very rooted in human experience. Anyone could pick it up and understand what he's trying to get at. What I also read, and this is the largest section of this work, is his reflections on the French Revolution, and he's critiquing it. I think he's writing the work to a Frenchman he knows, who's, of course, living at the time of the Revolution. I think he's writing it before the Reign of Terror, actually. And the prescience he has about the Reign of Terror is honestly quite startling. Just taken in a vacuum. So, that was just very interesting. I highly recommend Edmund Burke to really anyone, especially if you want to understand the modern traditionalist impulses as they pertain to politics and social order. Very interesting. I got a collection of these books, English Monarchs. This is done by the University of California Press. I read this work on William the Conqueror. I wanted to understand a little bit better the conflict that took place when the Normans came into England, and of course that's William the Conqueror. So this is just a biography on him, and it was just very interesting, just how you kind of understand the brute facts that, William the Conqueror invaded England, and you don't really understand why. you don't understand his motives or anything like that, or the pushback that at the time the English people had to the Norman conquest. So it's just very interesting because, of course, the Norman conquest influences things like Arthurian legends. So that was interesting to just kind of see, okay, this is how an English person prior to the conquest would have viewed this. I enjoyed that. At the beginning of the year, around Christmas time, I read Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. The beginning of the year 2025, I mean. And that was a lot of fun to read. This is a really nice copy. I think this is the Folio Society edition. I think I've showed this to you before. But the Consolation of Philosophy is very good. It's really foundational for if you live anywhere in what we call the West, you will enjoy it. I also read, this is, I think, Dave Matthews' work on the historical King Arthur, who that might have been. This was just interesting for really understanding and seeing how Arthurian legends developed, and also in what ways are a lot of the facts grounded in history. So that was just very interesting to read. I also probably recommend, if you like Arthurian stuff, I recommend that to you. This is a book that I got, I think I showed this to you. This is a book I got from my father for Christmas in 2024, I guess. And I had shipped it off to a bookbinder because when I got it, I knew it was going to be like this, but when I got it, the front and the back boards were completely detached. The spine was coming undone, and all of the binding was loose, and all of this tooling on here was very much faded. And I knew I might get this book before, and so I knew if I got it, I was going to have to send it off to have it repaired. And I sent it to, I highly recommend him, Michael Sasson. He's located in Sussex. I can't remember his business name. It's like Sasson Book Restoration, or Sussex Book Restoration, something like that. Highly recommend him. He put me on his list. I had emailed him right around the first of the year 2025 and just said, hey, I have this, put me on your list. And I think it was about June that he said, okay, send it to me. So I sent it, and we discussed, how I wanted it repaired, if I wanted anything rebound, if I wanted things retooled as close to the original as possible, which I did. And I got it back, I think in November. No, maybe it was October. Anyway, I got it back towards the end of the year. And this book is, I guess I'll tell you what it is, but this is Britain Long Ago. This is done by St. Martin in the Fields High School. I think this was published in like 1901 or something like that. So there's a script in here from whoever had it first, and they apparently gifted it to someone for the first prize on Form 4 in July of 1911. And then I put in here, Christmas gift from Dad, 2024. So this is, again, I'll show this to you here. This is Britain Long Ago, and it's a series of British tales. It has like the Tale of Taliesin, it has the Children of Lear, there's the Quest of the Seven Champions, which a lot of the tales in here are Arthurian in nature. It has the story of Caedmon, the herdsman poet, and it has a shortened version of Beowulf. And this was for young boys, and just being familiarized and studying and reading and enjoying tales of Britain, of their homeland. So I really enjoyed this. I've read at this point every single one of these, and sometimes multiple times, to my sons. We started reading before bed, and they've really enjoyed these stories. This now is the book that I've spent the most money on in my collection. I think I have other books that would be more expensive if I tried to sell them, but this is the one that I've spent the most money on, just having it repaired but it was just done so beautifully. I cannot recommend Michael Sasson enough. He did a wonderful job. I mean, you can barely see where this was detached, and he repaired it and put it back together. So just incredible. I also read C.S. Lewis's The Allegory of Love, and this was recommended to me in another book that I was reading on C.S. Lewis, and this really talks about how allegory is used in the medieval and early Renaissance period. So, like Tolkien said, this is a close quotation, but he says something to the effect of, I dislike allegory in all of its manifestations, and he much prefers applicability, which is just to say, I think he goes on to explain that allegory relies in the domination of the author over its reader, which of course he didn't like. I mean, read Lord of the Rings, and he doesn't like that idea. Whereas applicability, the reader saying, oh, this is applicable, this, Aragorn is applicable or could be applied to like something of a Christ figure in some way. But Tolkien says, well, that relies in applicability from the reader, relies in the freedom of the reader to do so and not the domination of the author over its reader. So this was a study in medieval tradition this is a series of C.S. Lewis's lectures. And it was very interesting. There's a section on here in the medieval work, The Romance of the Rose, and understanding the allegory in that, the allegory in Chaucer, which very much informs Shakespeare as well. So it's just very interesting if you want to understand allegory, because almost all medieval literature or poetry that was written for fun, for entertainment, is allegorical in nature. So that was very interesting as well. I read this every St. Patrick's Day. This is The Life of St. Patrick by W.B. Morris. And it's a hagiography, but W.B. Morris establishes in his preface, and I think in the first chapter, he establishes why we can have reasonable confidence in a lot of these stories, because a lot of them are recounted in historical documents within living memory, and sometimes written by the disciples of St. Patrick, people who knew him. So, this is very good. It's just, again, it's hagiographical in nature, so it's good just to read it's a really enjoyable saint story to read on St. Patrick's Day. I also got this copy of J.R.R. Tolkien's Tales from the Perilous Realm. So this has like Smith of Wootton Major. It has Leaf by Niggle in here. Has Roverandom, Farmer Giles. What else? The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And then it also has his essay on fairy stories. I read through all of these just periodically throughout the year. I read a couple of the stories. Some of them are a little bit longer, like Roverandom's kind of long for my sons to really sit and listen to. But we read some of this together, and it's just, I hadn't ever read like Leaf by Niggle or Roverandom or Farmer Giles. Smith of Wootton Major, hadn't ever read those, so it was fun to read those. I also read The Wind in the Willows. I've ended up reading this once a year as well, at least. One other thing that I ended up doing this year that I haven't done before with Wind in the Willows is I would find, because so much of Wind in the Willows is at different times of year. So the beginning is during the spring, and then there's the section where, what is the chapter Dulce Domum, or part of Mr. Badger's, the episode in Mr. Badger's house takes place during the winter. And I found that it's really enjoyable since I know the entire story. I'm not losing out on anything if I just kind of dip in and read a chapter here or there. So, 3 weeks ago, I sat down and read Dulce Domum during the winter. It's cold outside, and so it's just very much fun to read with the seasons in that way and just enjoy the story as kind of these detached episodes that take place in The Wind in the Willows. Another thing I read, and this was along the strain of really kind of digging into the conservative political tradition, particularly as manifested in America, and really having a better understanding of why conservatives hold particular policy positions. One of the things I read is William F. Buckley Jr.'s God and Man at Yale. This was a lot of fun to read. William F. Buckley is one of my favorite authors and writers. His command of the English language is just so incredible. He also, what was I going to say? William F. Buckley Jr. is also something of the father of modern conservatism in America. And so if you're a modern conservative, you really should be familiar with William F. Buckley. And again, he's just a master of the English language, so he's just fun to read as well. This book, Up From Liberalism, is also very good. It's his critique on liberal policy, which is very interesting because in so much he's not necessarily being polemical. In so much he tries to say, okay, this is what like the conservative and the liberal both want to reach this particular goal, and here's how the liberal goes about trying to get there. And then he critiques it, of course. So that was very interesting. Again, master of the English language. I encourage you to read him. The thing I read probably most often for fun, for entertainment, was Woodhouse. And I've shared some of this with you. He's hilarious. It's just so funny. I don't think I've laughed harder at a piece of literature than some of the stories in here. So highly recommend this. It's easy to pick up again and read over stories that you've already read. Highly recommend. I got turned on to this I started listening to this gentleman more, Andrew Klavan. He's written several books, and he was a screenwriter in Hollywood for decades, as far as I know. But he has these books, and I don't know how you would describe this. They're like thriller mystery books, I guess. And I mean, even Sherlock Holmes stories aren't this way, aren't really thrillers in that sense, in the modern sense. And I've never really read anything in this sort of genre, and I really liked it. It was a good read. Andrew Klavan has a really good grasp on the English language. He's a really interesting writer. So I enjoyed reading this. This is his first book in this series. The series centers on this person, Cameron Winter, and this is the first book in that series. Along the same line, I got the second book in that series, A Strange Habit of Mind, which I don't know how much I would recommend these books to someone. If you like thrillers like this, crime thrillers like this, I would recommend it. You would enjoy it. Andrew Klavan is an interesting writer. A lot of his writing he interacts with the culture as it is today. And so it's nice when you're reading a lot of old literature, you get interactions and critiques on the way the world was whenever that person was writing. So it's interesting to read someone who's writing these books today. I think he just had the fifth installment in that series come out in the last several months. So it's interesting to see kind of some of the social issues that we hear about on the news or whatever all the time. It's interesting to hear him interact with those. So, and of course, this isn't the copy that I ended up reading the most, but the copy I did is very heavy and it's up on the top of the shelf. But I read The Lord of the Rings, of course, and of course, always good. Again, I start reading that in September, and this year I ended actually sooner, but I think I had read through it by the middle of October. So I read through that fairly quickly. The last one I have here, there's actually a couple more, but the last one I have here is Tolkien's Modern Reading. This is by Holly Ordway. This is very interesting because we often have this picture of Tolkien as this old professor, curmudgeonly, didn't like new-fangled things and preferred to read old literature. And Ordway establishes, no, that's actually not the case. She actually identifies the issue that many people kind of merge Tolkien and Lewis too much in their imagination. And so you have this kind of monster, which is a mixture of Tolkien and Lewis. And it's Lewis who was very much more, he didn't enjoy modern literature, modern music, anything like that. He was much more the curmudgeon in that way. And Tolkien was very much open to modern technology. I think a famous story is when he got a radio, he made the sign of the cross over it and prayed the Our Father in Welsh over the radio or something like that. But Ordway establishes in terms of technology, Tolkien had he had the nicest, newest typewriter. He had a car because he had family and kids, so he had critiques on those technologies, but he still used them and appreciated them. And subsequently, he was very much informed. His imagination was very much formed by modern books, modern stories, modern fairy tales. So that was just eye-opening, and it was actually kind of fun because I walked away with probably close to 20 recommendations for different books that Tolkien would have read growing up as a young boy that I could get for my boys. So that was very interesting. I also read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I always start that on Christmas Day because that's when it starts, and then I try and finish it on New Year's Day because that's when it ends. So it's kind of nice just to cap out the year every year. Again, that's not everything that I read this year, but those are all kind of the big physical books that I read. What I'd like to get to now is our piece of poetry. And I mentioned this before, but this is from Shakespeare's play Richard II. And this is towards the end. If you haven't read it, you really should. If you would have a hard time reading the play, you probably have an Amazon Prime subscription. Watch the Hollow Crown series. It's very good. They do, just for the sake of time, in some places they'll take out a section of the play, but it's very minimal. You don't really lose anything, and it's all verbatim. The script that they have, it's Shakespeare. So it's very good. Again, it's very well produced, and the actors and actresses in the show are very good. They do very well, so I highly recommend it to you. But this is in Pomfret Castle. This is when Richard II is imprisoned before his death. And this is one of his soliloquies. I think this would be his last soliloquy. And this is in, where is this? This is in Act 5, Scene 5. And this is Pomfret Castle. And I'll start kind of halfway down here. Let's start here. So this is King Richard talking about himself being king and unkinged by Bolingbroke. He says, "Thus play I in one person many people, and none contented. Sometimes am I king. Then treasons make me wish myself a beggar, and so I am. Then crushing penury persuades me I was better when a king. Then am I kinged again, and by think that I am unkinged by Bolingbroke, and straight am nothing, but whate'er I be, nor I nor any man that but man is, with nothing, shall be pleased till he be eased with being nothing." Music, do I hear? Music starts playing. Ha ha, keep time. How sour sweet music is, when time is broke and no proportion kept. So is it in the music of men's lives. And here have I the daintiness of ear to check time broke in a disordered strong. But for the concord of my state and time had not an ear to hear my true time broke. I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. It goes on from there, but I really enjoyed that. The book I'm reading is also on Shakespeare, and this year it kind of seems like I'm tending towards reading more Shakespeare this year. So I hope you enjoyed that. It was really nice to see you again, and we'll see you next week.